wanted to take advantage of the disadvantage that we can't meet in person by asking him to talk about his latest book, which is called Secondhand. And I will put the Amazon link on the comment threads in case you want to buy it. And both Leslie and I have read it and think it's great. But without further ado, Adam, can you take the mic, so to speak?
I think I can. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen in just a second because I have a bunch of slides I want to show everybody. But just quickly, thanks, Virginia, for having me, and thanks for everybody for being here and hearing what I'm going to share with you. It's kind of intimidating for me. Listening this morning, everybody on this call knows 10 times more about textiles than I do. But hopefully I'll be bringing something that you haven't seen before about the recycling of textiles to the table. And it's also intimidating to me because Virginia is my friend, but I don't know if I've ever acknowledged this. One of her books, I believe it was 1998, The Future and Its Enemies, had a huge influence on me. And so to be giving a talk with Virginia on the other end is a little bit intimidating to me because that book meant quite a bit to me over the years. So I am going to share my screen and take you on a little journey. I found with doing Zoom presentations, and I've done a few over the last few months, I think sharing pictures and doing slideshows and really telling a story about what I've seen instead of just lecturing you tends to works best. So I'm going to share this and hopefully, let's see, and we will go play from start. Okay, I'm hoping you can see this okay. Okay, so as Virginia indicated, I came out with a book in November called Secondhand, which is an exploration of secondhand goods. And it's something that I've been interested in for a long time, in part because my family was in the recycling business. We had a small junkyard in the Twin Cities for many years. And I spent a lot of time, not just in the junk piles, but in thrift shops with my grandmother, who was an immigrant, daughter of immigrants who had done the kind of work you're seeing here. And so when I started this a few years ago, I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I wanted to do something with clothing as well as some other product types. And that took me to Arizona, where I spent about a month embedded in a Goodwill, just learning how a Goodwill operates. And this is really the starting point for me of the whole book in many respects. This is a sorting room at a Goodwill in Tucson, and people are just taking the donations of clothes, sorting them into the various types of clothes: trousers, men's, shirts, women's, baby clothes, sheets, whatever it is. You can see Mackenzie there on the right. She's holding a sweater, and that's one of the reasons I took this picture. Because I was wondering what happens to sweaters in Arizona. And it turns out they aren't sold in Arizona because nobody really wants a sweater in Arizona. Jumping forward to Mississauga, Ontario. This is a big sorting warehouse in Mississauga. Some of you might know Mississauga. It's a suburb. It's almost a city now of Toronto. And it's one of the world's great hubs for clothing recycling. And if you read the book, it explains why. But millions of tons of clothes from North America flow into Toronto every year after they haven't sold in the thrift shop. So only about 25% to a third of what goes into a thrift shop actually sells in the thrift shop. What doesn't sell, a good chunk of it flows to Mississauga, where they sort it again to be exported. And it's really interesting. They will say, okay, this color and this garment type works really great in Nigeria, so let's pack a load for Nigeria. This type works really well for Malaysia, Port Klang. And so they sort it there, and it's mostly South Asians, Indians and Pakistanis who run the business, and they have connections all over the world, and they send out containers. And there's a picture I took about a month after I took that one in Mississauga. This is in Benin in West Africa, in Cotonou, which basically sorts all the clothes for Nigeria, which is the most populated country in West Africa. And it's very skilled work. The men you see doing this aren't just throwing stuff into bags. They will know, what kinds of fashions, what kinds of fabrics are favored in, a particular region, a particular town, in a village in Nigeria, and they'll pack a bag for it. And you really need to know what you're doing. In my opinion, and I think it's pretty definitive, they have far more knowledge of what Americans generate in their closets than we do. So it's really fun. So I followed this around for quite a while, and one thing kept coming up is, what do you do with the sweaters? Because most of the world's used clothing, if it doesn't sell in the place where it's generated, it flows to warm climates: West Africa, East Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and they don't need sweaters. Now, some of the clothing, if it's not a sweater, if it's not wool, can be made into rags, and that's the end point for a lot of clothing. And these are rags at a rag factory in Ohio. You just cut up the shirts and you sell them, say, to places that need to wipe down tables. But there's nowhere to go with this stuff that was obvious to me. And so I really started contemplating this and asking people, and they said, well, there are some people in Mississauga who buy it. And long story short, a name got named, and that took me back to this ballroom, which was in Dubai in 2015, where I met the man on the right. His name is Nohar Nath, and he's standing next to a man by the name of Ramesh Goyal, who recycles wool, and that's about as much as Ramesh smiles. By the way, you won't get much more of a smile out of him. Nohar, on the other hand, is a wonderful, really wonderfully friendly guy. I met him in Dubai. He was giving a lecture on what he called the poor man's blanket. It was a recycling convention, and that term stuck with me, and so did his business card. And so when I started the book, I sent Nohar an email asking if I could see how they make the poor man's blanket, because he said they made them from wool. And this doesn't happen very often in journalism, as Virginia can tell you. He said, sure, when can you be in Mumbai? And I said, about 2 weeks. And so that's what I did. I flew to Mumbai, and I got to know Nohar and his element, which was fun. He's a really interesting person. And he then took me to see how this happens. Let me back up now to 1813. So I'm guessing there might be somebody on the call who knows what this is. I wouldn't have known until I started looking for it. So the problem of how to recycle wool is really old. It basically dates back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when you had all these knitting mills producing all this wool, and you can't, it doesn't work. Wool sweaters don't work great as a rag for wiping up a spill. They can't absorb anything. And people were really worried about this. What do you do with it? And one of the solutions was, well, you can use it as fertilizer, and you can. If it's a pure wool sweater, it works as fertilizer. But as I found in my career of covering the recycling industry, there's always going to be somebody who's going to try and figure out a way to make money from something that nobody else wants. And the person who figured it out was a guy by the name of Benjamin Law in 1813 in Batley, England. And this is a mill for making shoddy. And all it does is you throw in your sweaters. I don't think they were throwing in sweaters in 1813, but you throw in your wool, and it grinds it up, and you get this. This is the muck that comes out of a shoddy mill. So this is a photo taken during the Civil War, and famously, shoddy was used to clothe a lot of soldiers during the Civil War because it was cheap and plentiful. If you have your choice, and if anybody has ever touched shoddy, it's not something you really want to put on yourself. It's heavy, it's coarse. We'll get to that in a minute. It smells musty, even once it's been cleaned, but it's cheap. And it worked really great during the Civil War when soldiers needed something to wear. By all means, take pity on them, because it would have been incredibly, warm. If you think about, say, trooping through Georgia, in the 1860s in a heavy wool uniform. So I found out, well, there are people like Nohar are buying wool to make shoddy. He wasn't the first person to do this. The trade actually was primarily centered in the US and in the UK until about the 1930s, when labor rates got too high and demand for cheap clothing moved to Italy. And so for about 30 to 40 years, Prato, Italy, I'm sure some of you know about Prato, was the world capital of shoddy making. And then, the forces of globalization and labor and everything else started happening. It became too expensive to happen in Prato. And the market for it after World War II wasn't as big. Europeans started getting affluent. They didn't want to wear heavy, old, musty wool anymore. They wanted new wool. And so slowly but surely, it started shifting to India. And it started out in Mumbai in the mid-1970s, but for a number of reasons, including labor rates and labor strikes, it moved to a place called Panipat. which prior to the shoddy trade was only famous for an ancient battle, I guess. But Panipat is located about 60 miles north of Delhi. And when it started, the shoddy trade in Panipat, it took about 6 hours to drive there from Delhi. These days, you can do it in about 90 minutes. And so after showing me his offices in Mumbai, Nohar, and I took a flight to Delhi, spent the night in Delhi, and then he had his driver, and this is a very lucrative business, drive us up to Panipat the next day. So I'm going to show you what this industry looks like today in Panipat, and it's fascinating. I'm just going to walk you through a factory. So when you get into your average Panipat facility, right now there are about 150 shoddy mills in Panipat still. It's the largest concentration in the world. There are millions of tons of wool that move into Panipat every year, but it's shrinking, and we'll get to why. This is what you see: is you basically see these big bags of wool sweaters, maybe wool cuttings from factories. You know, a contractor for Uniqlo, say, in Bangladesh, they may have a bunch of extra wool that they would sell into Panipat as well. It may not be usable. So it's sorted out by color, and there's a lot of color sorting, as you'll see. Again, this is inside one of the warehouses. And again, getting it sorted by color is really important for obvious reasons. They do dyeing in these facilities, but for money saving, they would prefer not to be dyeing. They'd like to have just a few different colors. And it's quite physical work, actually, as you can imagine. One of the things that struck me as I toured Panipat over a couple of days is just how muscular the people are who do this kind of work, because they're lifting these, you know, these huge armfuls of clothing all day long. Again, here you have, it's a little bit more obvious here. These are the sweaters. And that's all Panipat buys because nobody else does. And it's very, very cheap, and it's getting cheaper. At the time I was there, you could get these sweaters, and it's sold as a commodity for around 10 cents a pound, which is very cheap. It's fallen considerably since then. And it actually has nothing to do with COVID. I'll get to why in a few minutes. Once you've got your color sort, it will start flowing into the warehouses, and it's not done when you're done sorting. You have another stage to the process before you can recycle this fabric. The women sitting around here, you can't see it, but you will in a second, are actually cutting buttons and zippers off of these garments. And as you see here, these are, I mean, there's like machetes that they have. She's not holding it between her knees. It's actually on the ground. And again, it's quite dangerous work when you think about, you know, working a full day of doing this. If you aren't alert, you could very easily slice your finger. Again, very skillful. I watched them for quite a while, and it's very warm. These are not air-conditioned warehouses. This is Delhi. You know, when you're there in the summer, you know, in a room full of wool, you can imagine it's not incredibly pleasant. It's very interesting. You find accounts of people, primarily women, doing this work in as far back as the 18th century in the United States. Only they weren't recycling the fabric back then for making into shoddy, but it was actually being used for paper making, and it would be cotton garments. So primarily in colonial America, paper was made from cotton. Here is a different Panipat factory where they're doing the same thing, cutting off the zippers and buttons, only they're doing it with these automated cutters, which are quite similar to the ones you'll actually see in American factories that make rags. Again, a little bit dangerous, highly skilled work. There's a close look at what one of these is. And these are actually manufactured near Panipat because they wear out very quickly. So what happens with those buttons and zippers and all the hard stuff? They go to the button salesman. And this guy was actually across the street from Ramesh Knitting Mills, and he buys them, and he sorts through them, and he's got, I don't think in this picture, but he actually has a magnet as well that he uses to take out the metal, and he'll sell some of the metal to scrapyards if he doesn't think it can go back to textile factories, apparel factories, but a lot of it he sells back to apparel factories. And this is a very, very competitive business, and it's not something that only happens in Panipat. As I learned when I was doing this book, and I was never able to do this reporting, and it's open to anybody who wants it. It's a great story. Virginia, this is all yours. It's a great story for you. apparently there's a surplus of Levi's, cheap Levi's, that nobody wants to recycle anymore. The denim is hard to recycle, and there's not much of a market for some of the more recent makes of Levi's. So that stuff gets shipped to Bangkok, where they use these same kinds of machines to cut off the Levi's buttons and zippers, and then they sell them to factories that are making counterfeit Levi's. And Bangkok has become the counterfeit Levi's capital of the world. And it's partly fueled by the recycling of new Levi's, which is, really mind blowing. It wasn't something I had the chance to do. So it belongs to anybody who wants it. I can even give you some contacts. So anyway, back inside Ramesh knitting mills, you can see this is stuff that's ready to be turned into shoddy. It's been sorted by color. And this is what the shoddy mill looks like. You can see he's got a bunch of pieces of basically orangish stuff that's going to go into this machine. And if you look at that machine and you look at this one, this is the black, and it gives you an idea of just how much stuff they're feeding into these mills. And this is actually the shoddy once it's come out. It's extraordinary. It's mountains and mountains of stuff. And it shouldn't be a surprise when you see the kinds of trade data that they have and the millions of pounds of material that comes in there. Here it is from the back end again. He's making orange. He's grinding up the orange stuff. And what comes out is thread. Once you've done all this. Now, this is where I'm on kind of thin ice, because I'm going to talk about yarn, and this is the only thing I know about shoddy yarn. The thread count is very low, usually around 10 to 12 threads per strand of yarn, if that makes any sense. So it's you can imagine it's very coarse, it's very poor quality. And if you look at what they're putting into these, in what they're putting in to make the thread, you can see why. Here's a closer view of just straight up shoddy yarn, and we'll get to what happens with it in a moment here, which is right here. So here you have the actual knitting mills, and the average the average production out of one of these when they feed the yarn in is about 1,000 kilograms a day, so about a ton. So you can make about a ton of shoddy fabric a day in Panapat, which is not a lot. And we'll get to why that's a problem. Somehow these slides got mixed up. Here's the orange. I thought I set this up, so we're jumping back and forth. Here's the orange. You can see they make other colors of thread here. Sorry that I don't know how this got jumbled. Anyway, it's jumbled, but you get the idea. And here's the dyeing area. Now, they weren't dyeing the day I was there, but about 90% of the shoddy is dyed. Interesting note, they said, obviously they love black because they don't need to dye it. And one thing they told me, and this must be a fashion thing, they said, it used to be 5 years ago, only about 15% of the wool clothing coming into Panapat was black. Now it's 25%. And so again, these are some of the just sort of the fun and interesting things you find out when you cover the recycling trade, is just the stuff that's coming out of people's homes. So they're dyeing less. And you can see this is stuff that's come out of the dyeing room. It's really deep green. Obviously, they're not going to be getting enough of that sort of turquoise to be just putting it into the choppers. Back into the where they're actually doing the knitting. Now, a couple interesting things about the machines that they have going here. Here's a good view of them. As you can see, these machines are old. And that's a big problem. Most of these come in from Europe. They are 40 and 50 years old. They were used in the shoddy mills of Italy. Nobody is making these machines for shoddy anymore. And so, the big shoddy mills in Panapat, they will send buyers out, looking for these machines all over the world because they just don't exist. Now, of course, you can get new machines, but the problem is they can't handle that really coarse thread, that 10 to 12 thread count thread. I just wrote down some notes. I went through my Panapat notes before talking to y'all this morning. A machine like this runs at 170 RPM. The slowest you can get for a newer machine is around 350. So if you put really coarse yarn in there, as it was explained to me, it's just going to jam up, and you're not going to get anything very nice out of it. Here you can see a little bit more of decorative weave. The other thing about shoddy in Panapat is, and anywhere is there's only so much you can do with it. There's only so many patterns. You can make this, and they've got a handful of patterns that they can, sort of feed into these older machines, but it's not particularly interesting. And the designs that Panapat was making 20 years ago are generally the designs that it's making today. So if you're a fashion conscious shoddy buyer somewhere in northern India, there's not going to be a whole lot of variety for you. The good news from the point of view of somebody who makes shoddy in Panapat is that their market is not regular people. Nohar had said to me, and he used the term over and over, poor man's blanket, but that is not the primary market. Here you can see some green ones as well. That's not the primary market for this stuff. Only about 10% of the production that comes out of Panapat is for people's homes. 90% of it today and in the past is for relief blankets. Now, that's a term that may be unfamiliar to all of you, but you've all seen them. If you think about when the Red Cross or the UN High Commission arrives for a relief operation where there's been an earthquake or there's been a pandemic and people need blankets and food, the blankets they are bringing in are called relief blankets. And up until 5 years ago, 95% of those blankets were made in Panapat, and they were made from shoddy. And they were cheap, and Panapat could make a lot of them because there were 600 factories, and the big factory could make about 40,000 blankets in a month. So it's a lot of production. So you multiply that out over a whole city, you're going to be talking about a lot of relief blankets. Now, if you're in an earthquake zone and you need a blanket, you're not going to be very fussy about the blanket you get, and you're not going to mind the fact that it's a little bit musty. And here you can see these are going to be sold retail in northern India. These are not the relief blankets, but you can see what they look like. But they're heavy. They're rough on the skin. Even after they've been washed, they do smell a little bit musty. And once the blankets are done, you can see they put some ribbing around the edges of them. But in general, that's a shoddy blanket. And that's where most of the world's used wool that is sold, not landfilled, it goes to making that. But it was the relief blankets which were and still are the bread and butter of a place like Panapat. And here's an example of relief blankets. This was from a relief operation. I just took this off the UN High Commission for Refugees website. But if you look at that, you can tell that's not a shoddy blanket. That's a blanket made of polar fleece. And that's the problem, and that's sort of the threat to Panapat is polar fleece. If you think about what you would prefer for yourself if you are at home, much less in a relief zone, a polar fleece blanket is a far more attractive option. It's lightweight, it doesn't smell. These are gray, but it can also have multiple colors. And it's going to feel better on your skin. That's just not my observation. About 10 years ago, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs started figuring that out as well. So this is a factory for making polar fleece. Polar fleece doesn't require recycled wool. All it requires is petroleum. And petroleum is something that India has in surplus. They are a major producer. About 10 years ago, China started making polar fleece very cheaply. And 10 years ago, it would cost about $10, their production cost for a polar fleece blanket. It was very, very expensive. They've driven the cost down to about $2.50 now. The price of a shoddy blanket is about $2. So you can see a shoddy blanket for $2, a polar fleece blanket for $2.50. You can see what people will prefer. That's going to make this easier. But the fixed costs, I mean, if you want shoddy, there's not many wool sweaters being generated in India, so you got to import them. So you have very, very expensive fixed costs to bring all those sweaters to India, whereas India has a lot of petroleum products and refineries, so they have a lot of quick access to cheap raw materials for making polar fleece. So starting 10 years ago, the polar fleece from China started to outcompete, even for the relief blankets, the shoddy mills in Panapat. And we've gone from about 600 shoddy mills in Panapat to right now about 150. Probably COVID will take care of a bunch more. And the big entrepreneurs, the big operators in Panapat said, we got to do something, otherwise we're going to be out of business. And so this particular polar fleece mill belongs to Ramesh Goyal, who's shoddy mill you were just seeing. And if you've never seen polar fleece made, this is what it looks like. And this is right next door to his shoddy mill. So he's still making, you know, shoddy on those old pieces of equipment, but he's making polar fleece right here on equipment he imported from Wuxi, China. You know, here's, yeah, this is a very different look from the yarn being made next door. And then here you go, is just, you know, the raw sheets of polar fleece rolling off of the mill. And so, well, I'll get to the data. What do they do with it? Here's the other advantage. So here's inside the polar fleece blanket mill next door to Ramesh Goyal's shoddy mill. You can silk screen it, and this is the silk screening operation. And what they'll do is they'll just take these giant sheets of polar fleece and lay them out. They don't even cut them yet, and they can have any number of different patterns, you know, and they buy the patterns online. I didn't know you could do this for these blankets, and their supplier in China, they can buy a new pattern from that supplier, and they can do any number of colors. It's not like the problem that you have with the shoddy, where there's only a handful of colors, and you know, and that's what it's been for 20 years. They can do all kinds of things with these. That's actually on the second floor. Then you can just see ropes of these blankets, not having been cut yet, coming down from the second floor to the first floor, and then being washed. Again, you know, you can just sense the scale of what they're doing. These lines can do 40,000 blankets in a space of a few days, whereas it takes that much time for the shoddy mills. And so predictably, the Red Cross, the UN High Commission have all started switching to these kinds of blankets. And then you can just see piles of them there, and they will hand stitch the ribbing back onto them, you know, which, and that's sort of the full cycle of how it works. So I tell that story in Secondhand, but you know, it's a very interesting lesson in recycling. I think especially with fabrics, my experience of writing this book, and I count myself amongst people who feel this way. I think we take it for granted that there is a destination for all these fabrics that we don't want when we drop them off at a Goodwill or however else it is we sell them. But just like anything, they're subject to markets and consumer preferences, and when consumers create markets, and when they have the ability to buy something better than our recycled wool, they will. And so a place like Panapat is extremely threatened. Just to give you a sense, I wrote, again, I went into my notes, you know, before polar fleece came along, Ramesh told me they were making 12,000 kilos per week, or excuse me, per day of shoddy. That's a lot of shoddy. Now, since they've started running the polar fleece mill, they're making 15, of which 9 is polar fleece. So their shoddy production is shrinking as their polar fleece is expanding. And that's the story all over Panapat, and it will be. You know, is there something else that can be done with used wool? You know, maybe some of the folks on the call here will know better than me. I just spoke to someone about a week ago who told me that Muji, I'm sure you're all familiar with Muji, the Japanese retailer, they're all over the world. They've actually started buying some shoddy in Panapat, but that's not going to be nearly the kinds of volumes that were bought when they were, you know, supplying the Red Cross with all of its relief blankets. So what will happen to this stuff? You know, I don't know. But we do know before COVID that the price of used wool on the global market had dropped to 2 to 3 cents per pound. It's a huge drop. Probably it's worth nothing now. And folks in Panapat were telling me that at some point, the Europeans in particular are going to have to pay Panapat to recycle this. It's not something Panapat's going to pay for anymore because there's just no incentive to do it. So that's kind of the bad news, but it's good news in the sense that people now have access to lots of cheap polar fleece. And if you're in an earthquake, you won't have a bunch of rough, coarse shoddy on your skin, you know, keeping you uncomfortable through the night. So I'm all game for taking any kinds of questions folks have, and just in hearing any of your reactions you might have to the presentation.
Adam, there are some questions in the chat.
Sure.
one is that you at one point said knitted, but it looks like shoddy is actually woven. Is that
Right, right. I'm sorry. Yeah. Like I said, I'm not a textile expert.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's see. And then somebody asked what happens to the sweaters made from acrylics.
Right.
Real wool sweaters are pretty scarce these days.
Yeah. So acrylics are a problem. They don't go to Panapat. They generally are in a place like India. If they do end up there, they will be segregated and then they're sent to a waste incinerator where they're viewed as basically a petroleum product. There just isn't anywhere for that stuff to go. And that's the same with polar fleece. It's interesting. Polar fleece is a petroleum product, so it makes really good fuel when people are done with it.
So the recycling, another question was, what's the polar fleece recycling cycle? And it's used as
there
fuel,
is none.
basically.
Yeah, yeah, it's a disposable product.
Yeah. I will, okay, I'm gonna take the risk of unmuting everybody. So if you, somebody asked, can shoddy be felted in such, can shoddy be felted? Somebody mentioned yurt wall or structures for animals or containers for storage.
It could be. I mean, the question I guess would be, is it competing against something else? Is it worth doing? I mean, that's always the question, you know.
I wondered, and I don't know whether you know this, but is there something inherent in the recycled wool that means it has to be coarsely spun and go back to muting everybody? Is there something inherent in this wool that you have to spin it coarsely? You couldn't spin it more finely and weave it more finely? Oh dear, I got to unmute you, Adam.
Okay. I don't think so. I spoke to Nohar about that. That was the question I had. Why does it have to be so coarse? And he said, you know, he he made 2 points. He said, one, you know, anytime you recycle something, and I know this from reporting on recycled paper, the fibers do get smaller. You know, fibers are broken down in the recycling process. That said, he said that it is possible in theory to make a finer yarn. But who's going to produce the equipment to do that? And that's sort of the bottleneck. There isn't much of an incentive at this point.
And the market for wool is small anyway, even
exactly
for really high quality wool. If you have a question, I guess raise your hand. I gave up on the not muting people, or put something on the comments and I'll read it. So Adam, can you talk a little bit about what you learned at Goodwill? Yeah.
Well, that's some of my favorite reporting I've ever done. And I didn't know what to expect when I showed up there. I told Goodwill, first I had to find a Goodwill that would let me do what I wanted to do, which was just sit around and watch how they do their business. And not many Goodwills were very interested in having somebody just come around and watch them do their business. But finally, the folks in Southern Arizona, based in Tucson, said, sure, come on down. And so I spent most of my time doing one of two things. One, sitting on a stool by a donation door and just watching everything come in, which was kind of life altering. Just seeing the volume of stuff, and it really changed. I'm not one to preach at people, but if you spend a couple weeks watching everything flow into the Goodwill, when you get home, you are going to start getting rid of stuff. It's just a natural progression of things. But the other thing I spent my time doing was what you saw in that picture, which is sitting with the sorters and watching how they how they go through the things that we donate. I think there's a lot of myths and legends about Goodwill throwing stuff, just, heave-hoing things that are donated. That's not what happens for them. They want to extract every penny they can out of this. And so they're very, very sophisticated about how they sort things. And that really shocked me. Not just, okay, they're going to pull something out of the pile of clothes that came in and put a tag on it, but there's actually thought that goes into what the brands are, and they will have pricing charts for what brands should be. They'll cross-reference to types of fabrics, to types of garments, and that is constantly being adjusted because they want to generate as much revenue for that stuff as possible, not for profits. They are a nonprofit because they use it to fund all kinds of social services, including a lot of job training that's going to become incredibly important as we start to recover from COVID. So that to me was really interesting, just the level of sophistication of the sorting.
Somebody asked if you could give a rough breakdown of the diversion of various garments in the end-of-life garment recycling stream, since shoddy is a fairly niche market.
Yeah, it is. Shoddy is a niche market. It's an interesting one, but it's a niche one. So if you go just from the donation door, so when stuff comes through the donation door, it's immediately sorted. Roughly half of it will actually make it onto the sales floor. The other half is divided into a number of different things. It varies by location. What you're going to get donated in Arizona is going to be very different from what's donated in Minneapolis. I mean, for example, you're just not going to have many sweaters donated in Tucson. But just roughly speaking, the fast fashion, the Uniqlo stuff, things like that are not going to go out onto the sales floor because people won't buy them. They know it doesn't last very long. You know, after 2-3 washes, you're seeing pilling. So some of that there is overseas markets for that, and it will be packaged to be sold to brokers in places like Toronto, Mississauga, and Houston. If clothing is soiled, if socks and undergarments that stuff is immediately bound for the landfill or an incinerator because for health considerations, there's no secondary market for it. If garments come in that are ripped and torn and won't sell overseas or in North America, a lot of that will then be packaged for rag cutting operations. And as Virginia knows, there's a chapter in the book where I actually show you the rag industry, which is a fascinating hidden industry that supplies so many industries and is really the end point for a lot of clothing. So that clothing will end up there. As for the stuff that goes onto the sales floor, only about 25% to 1/3 will actually sell at your average thrift store in North America. They're always trying to push that up, but it's getting harder because the quality of clothing, we all know this, isn't what it used to be. And clothing as well, you know, one of the Goodwill stores I spent time in was across the street from a Walmart. And so the manager of that Goodwill was always conscious that she needed to price competitive with Walmart. Because people will, given the choice, buy new, especially if the quality is the same. So they want to push it up over 1/3, but it's hard. Of that 2/3 that's left over, Goodwill at least will send it to an outlet. And I'm sure some of you have seen these where clothing, secondhand is sold by the pound. And on average, of the stuff that's sold by the pound, about 12% of that makes its way through out the door that way. And then what doesn't sell there in the outlet is generally sent to graders in Mississauga and some in Houston and sold overseas, where there's huge demand for good quality secondhand clothing.
So if you really want detailed answers to this, I highly recommend that you get Adam's book. Because he really did a lot of legwork, and it's absolutely fascinating. And it's not just about clothing, it's about technology and home furnishings. And one thing I learned from the book is if anyone ever comes up with an economically valuable thing to do with used bowling balls, they will make a fortune.
It's true.
One thing that absolutely everybody donates, and no, it absolutely has no market for it.
Right. No, it's true. You look into the disposal bin at your average Goodwill, and there's always bowling balls at the bottom. And everywhere I went in the secondhand world were bowling balls that nobody wanted. You never think about this stuff, until you're in the back room at a Goodwill.
And somebody asked about having yarn that says it's made from recycled saris. Do you know what form of recycling that is?
I don't. That would be, would that be silk? I'm just not sure.
Well, it is silk.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's either cutting small strips or unraveling, but
yeah.
Well, great. Thank you very much.
Oh my gosh, no, it's an honor, Virginia. Thank you for inviting me.
We're
It
getting
really is.
big kudos and thank yous on the chat.
So, well, thank you so much. And I see it also scary for our world. Let me just say one thing. I've shown you sort of from an environmental perspective. And in my book, I mean, it does touch on environmental issues, but it's not just about the environmental side of it. It's about consumption. But there is good news in clothing recycling. I mean, you know this too, Virginia. I mean, there's a lot of money going in to figure out what to do, especially with cotton poly garments, because those are difficult to recycle when you have cotton poly blends. And I really believe in the next few years, I think we're going to see a good solution for those garments, and you're going to be able to recycle the polyester fibers out of, say, the cotton t-shirts, and reuse those. So from an environmental standpoint, there is good news coming down the line, but from an environmental standpoint, on the wool side, it's not so great. That's true.
Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. Take care, everybody. Have a good morning back that way.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yep.
And next month we have Ari doing her presentation, and Clara will be the moderator. So be on the lookout for the directions of how to log on to that meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.